I call the order. Join this afternoon, the Housing Price Task Force. And today is March 12th. Before I get started, I'd like to have a reflection of tonight. Tonight is very special for me because a longtime friend, person in housing is here today. And as we celebrate Women's History Month, I want to say to you, Brenda, you've been one of the people that have made history around housing. You're a wonderful, wonderful advocate for the people. And people like myself, long before I got involved, you were already doing this stuff. So we appreciate you and having you tonight here. So I just wanted to say that as Women's History Month, and to your two team players that you have with you, happy Women's History Month. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairwoman Harris,
Present.
Vice Chairman Espino,
Present.
Councilwoman Graves,
Present.
Councilwoman Peterson,
Present.
Councilor Rogers is absent, 4 present, 1 absent. You have a forum.
Yeah, as we have our lovely clerks, we also have a legal person here today,
David Shine, yes.
And David, are you brand new or?
I'm semi-brand new. I've been there about a year or so, but I just started doing committees and things like that, so.
Okay, thank you for joining us here tonight at the Housing Price Task Force. We
Thank
are
you.
hard workers here. I think you're gonna appreciate us. Continue. We also have our policy person, Miguel Young. He's sort of keeping his head out the door, but he's also joined us tonight. Oh, there's Miguel. See, I'm trying to look at too many things. Oh, yeah, two legals. All right. Thank you. And you have joined us at the table. We have Brenda Clemens, and you're gonna present yourself for the record.
Sure. My name is Brenda Clement, and I'm Executive Director of Housing Works Rhode Island at Roger Williams University.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, could you please read the first item into the record?
Item 1, presentation from Brenda Clement, Director of the Housing Works Rhode Island at Roger Williams University.
Thank you again for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to come back to this group to talk about housing issues. And I introduced them to the chair, but I also just wanted to recognize 2 Roger Williams law students that are joining us today as part of joining Housing Works this week as part of alternative spring break. So unlike other students, they're not out partying anywhere. They're working hard. And so trying to bring them around to meet with groups and opportunities to see kind of housing and housing policy work in action. And so certainly the work that this committee has been doing is important stuff for them to be hearing about and learning about. So before I jump into kind of more specific housing, but certainly related, just on the theme of women in housing, as in your packet of material that we passed out this evening is an infographic that we developed last year, funded in part with Women's Fund. We'll be releasing a part 2 of this that does a deeper dive into some of this data and information about women in housing. And as you can see, particularly for lower wage women and women with families, housing and housing insecurity remains a big problem. We're the data partner with the Eviction Defense Project for both the city of Providence and the state of Rhode Island. And I can tell you that the bulk of people coming into eviction court are largely women, many of them women of color and women with children, and they have at 30% of median income or below. Rent is just too high, right? They cannot afford rent, and these are many of these individuals because we track jobs and income levels as part of that data. They all have income, they all have jobs, but they're just not in jobs that pay them living wages or housing wages as well. It gets particularly dire the older you get, and for women, and many of women often are out of the workforce, raising families or taking lower wage jobs because of family duties and responsibilities, and that catches up to you as you get older and don't have sufficient savings or pensions or other things that you can rely on in your retirement age. And so women and older women in particular are very insecure for housing and income moving forward. So, and while there's a lot of troubling data on here, I think there's also room for optimism and room for growth as well too, as we look at policy tools and levers to try to address some of those housing barriers and housing issues, how we look at creating and increasing the amount of housing for seniors, looking at things like ADUs and other ways that we can help people supplement their income if they're a higher, lower income homeowner, and also provide housing for a senior member in their family as well too. So a lot of stuff to chew on with that report. And as I said, in our report coming out at the end of March, early April, we'll be looking a little bit more specifically at particular types of workers and types of women who are most impacted by this work. So your policy staff and Christina Brown, who you know well, and I know Christina well, because she used to work with us at Housing Works and is a great colleague and friend as well too, shared with me kind of the summary. And as you know, I've been at some of the meetings where you've had a number of presenters talking about housing and talking about housing issues. You know, again, I see people who are at the table who already know all a lot about housing as well too, and have worked in community development and neighborhood development for a long period of time. But we also, so there's a lot of interesting ideas, you know, that you heard from the staff. You've heard a lot of data and information. And I just wanted to give you my thoughts and reflections on kind of next steps and things that you could do as a city council or meetings that you could do as a city council to kind of further the conversation. First of all, you know, from based on all of the media coverage, you know, housing is having its moment again, right? Because the housing cost, and it happens all the time when it floats up and housing affordability becomes an issue for more moderate income individuals. It's been housing has been a problem for a long, long time for very low income workers and very low income individuals. But when we start to see, as we collect in the fact book, you know, even if you're earning $75,000 or $100,000, you can't afford to buy anywhere in Rhode Island without being cost burdened. And as you know, cost burdened is a term from the federal government that means that if you're spending more than 30% of your income towards housing, you're considered cost burdened. And what that means at the higher income level, you know, and right now, even people who are at higher income levels are cost burdened, are spending more on their housing, rents higher than what they would like to spend. But at the higher income level, when you're trying to balance your family budget, you know, you make choices, right? Maybe you don't buy a new car this year, or maybe you don't put as much into savings, or you don't go on a trip or whatever. But as you go further down the income spectrum, those choices become much more dire. Our colleagues at the food bank say all the time that rent eats first. People try desperately to keep a roof over their head, to provide some stability for their family. And so it's no surprise that at a time of very high rents and low availability of affordable housing, we also see considerable spikes up in food pantry use and food kitchen use and so forth. And again, people are just trying to juggle all of it. We've all been there, I think, at some point where, you know, there's more a month than money, right? And so you try to continue to figure out how to balance your bills and balance your payments. So, and again, that population of people at that very low wage are the people who are struggling the most. But housing is getting the attention. And finally, we've seen some real push at the local level to get local cities and towns to step up and address some of the housing issues in the community, because this is not just a Providence problem. We see cost burden numbers in every single one of Rhode Island's 39 cities and towns. There are low wage workers and low wage individuals in every one of those cities and towns as well too. Rhode Island has had a law in the books called the Low to Moderate Income Housing Act, which I'm trying to remember who. I think you had folks from the Department of Housing in to talk about that, and I'm sure they mentioned that. This law has been on the books for close to 30 years, and it requires every community work towards a 10% goal of housing to be affordable in their community. Anyone want to wager a guess as to how many of our Rhode Island's 39 cities and towns actually meet that goal?
Only Providence.
No, a little bit more. I'd have to like, just like jump off a bridge or something, if that was all I succeeded in so far. But it's not good.
Only the 5 larger communities,
I'm
right?
sorry.
It's only the 5 larger communities, Central Falls, Pawtucket.
So, yes,
Providence,
it's
okay.
5 altogether, you're absolutely right. And it's some unusual suspects, in there, Providence and Newport. And Pawtucket is actually technically not at, that's my community, is technically not at the 10%. But a number of communities like Pawtucket and West Warwick and others did a little state house magic and exempted themselves from the law because they have more market rate affordable units, which really aren't affordable in this market. So we're trying to remove that exemption. But one of the 5 is actually New Shore, and on Block Island. And part of it is because they realized in Newport, and who am I missing? Oh my goodness. Central Falls, you said Central Falls. Yes, Central Falls. But the, part of, what they realized very early on was that they were a service economy. And that they had low-wage seasonal workers who couldn't come to the island and stay on the island during the peak season because there wasn't any housing options. So, and they realized that they couldn't keep a police chief and they couldn't keep a teacher for their school and all of the other things without also providing some affordable options. So, you know, they learned very on and they continue to maintain affordability, and their land trust works very hard to do that and to balance it with all the other things that we need to do around conservation. So we have to, so we've got a lot of work to do, but again, the legislature has, for the first time in my career, I've been doing this for a while, really focused on the city and town level, because what housing, funding for housing comes in Rhode Island largely from the federal government, some from the state government, but what you build, where you build, and how you build are all controlled at the local level. And so part of what we've been spending a lot of time on over the last couple of years is this little card, which you have in front of you, which is our zoning atlas. We're part of the National Zoning Atlas project that is looking at zoning and land use and planning for growth and development in our communities and figuring out how we can do a better job of planning and providing opportunities for everybody in our community and providing opportunities for those starter homes. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to how much of Rhode Island is zoned single family?
Say that
I
again.
didn't know there was gonna be a test today, did you?
Yeah.
How much of Rhode Island, and this is excluding protected land, by the way. So, you know, any kind of parks or, you know, recreation spaces that aren't buildable land, so 87% of Rhode Island is zoned single family. Providence is a little bit different, but in some districts, but a large swath of Providence is also zoned single family. And what does that mean? That means that, and a lot of what we like in Rhode Island, you know, like a Wickford Village or a Patuxent Village or kind of transit hubs and lines where we have some levels of density and walkability to neighborhoods and communities. Because of the age of housing stock in Rhode Island, most of that was built prior to the existing zoning. And under existing zoning could not be rebuilt. And that's why even in Providence, a lot of developers spend a lot of time and money going through very extensive neighborhood and zoning and land use processes here in the city. And Providence has done a better job on zoning and land use than any other communities in the state. But it's still an extremely long process to get things approved and permitted at the local level. And that's very much true in suburban communities. And that's why we're kind of stuck at that 5 and trying to get building and developing communities. You can see from our colleagues in Massachusetts that passed some pretty aggressive legislation around TOD or transit-oriented development, where they're requiring communities to build more densely around transit corridors and transit hubs. And those, but communities are resisting big time. I'm sure you've seen some of the law, and the state's attorney, Massachusetts Attorney General has filed a lawsuit against a couple of communities because of their unwillingness to comply with the law. So we'll see how that works out moving forward. But, you know, and we know that this is all related to kind of ongoing battle that we face, particularly in affordable housing development of classism and racism. You know, I sit on a number of state boards and, people used to couch it in more politically correct terms, but now they just say, you don't want black kids from South Providence moving into our neighborhood, or we don't want Hispanic homeowners, and I'm being blunt because this is what people will put on the public record nowadays, so that's a challenge, right? And so Providence alone shouldn't be shouldering this burden. We have to be working with all of the communities and not just the urban communities, because everybody has somebody within those communities to do that. So we're trying to use the zoning atlas as really, you know, to gather information about where transit hubs are, where is the urban growth boundary that as the state we've just determined that we want to encourage growth and development, where are ways that we can, what are the ways that we can encourage that development and redevelopment of existing buildings? A big swath of the bills that were passed last session, through the speaker's package of bills, was looking at repurposing and reusing buildings, trying to allow for redevelopment of commercial buildings into mixed-use developments, when that makes sense, looking at parking, looking at other requirements. As you know, we've also created a new Department of Housing, trying to deal with some of those bigger policy issues and implementation issues moving forward. So we've got a lot of very interesting stuff going on, and the moment is, you know, now, kind of act on this. And then we also, in this package of bills, so it's been a fun ride these last couple of years while we've had some COVID money, right? And we've had some recovery act funding and money. We were successful with working with our fellow housing advocates and advocating for really the biggest chunk of funding for the recovery, the $1.25 billion that every state got for recovery act. The bulk of that, actually well over 300 million, is going to housing and housing production. And that's great. But that is also includes, in my opinion, a lot of back payments that we haven't had, because as a state, Rhode Island has ranked dead last in for not only building permits, but also in per capita investment into housing. So we just have not been putting as much money into housing as our states around us, particularly Massachusetts and Connecticut. Our peak building period was in the mid-1980s. Looking around the room, some of you were not born in the mid-1980s. And so that means that we've got a lot of catch up to do, right? And so 250 million, 300 million sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but it's still going to only produce us, you know, hopefully 3,000-4,000 plus units of housing, but our deficit, particularly for lower wage workers, is much closer to about 25,000 units. So it will catch us up a little bit, but it's not going to catch us up, you know, but it's not going to bring us the whole way. And that money, as we know, is drying up, right? We expect the last tranche of that funding and money to be approved at the Rhode Island Housing Board meeting in May. The applications that came in January, we had 3 times the amount of requests for projects coming in that we have money for. So we know that a lot of good projects are going to not be funded on that round. But there's, you know, now then at least increased interest among developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, to kind of build and develop more housing units, and particularly more affordable units. So we're hoping that the legislature keeps some momentum up. I have a report for you from the bonds, the last housing bond, last 3 housing bonds, and the funding and money that was spent in those. We're due to update this report. Actually, they'll find the previous housing bond as well too. But you can see kind of where we've spent the money and where programs and investment have happened. You have these.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have another
Sure.
folder? This one?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have had me.
No, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Let me pass it around.
Just the other one, just this
which
one
one?
right here.
I think I gave you, I think
Oh,
my
okay.
last copy.
Yeah.
These are the other pages.
Thank you.
Those are the other pages of that. But anyway, this is the chart that I was going to particularly show you about kind of where we've spent bond funds. The governor proposed 100 million. And the bond pages should have a picture of that like this. And as you can see, quite a few units in Providence, affordable units. A lot of those were very affordable units, under 50% of median or below, which was tremendously needed. And again, you know, I will take every single dollar that we get for these bond funds, but it's still not enough. And it's, you know, we're catching up, but not catching up enough. The governor has proposed $100 million, in the current budget for another housing bond. In Rhode Island, any bond, a request over 10 million has to go out for voter approval. So we would be running another bond campaign, to convince voters. Voters have overwhelmingly supported bonds, in the past, and hopeful that they'll do the same if the legislature approves of going out. Housing advocates are trying to increase that number, because we know that there's gonna be a tremendous cliff effect when the Recovery Act funding and money is spent. So let me stop there before I kind of move into recommendations, because I've thrown a lot of information at you. But I'll stop there and see if there's any particular questions on what I've already said, and then move into what I think we can potentially do next.
Any committee members have a question? Or you just want to second and digest?
Yes, please.
Councilman,
So, but I remember the struggle that you had when, I think it was back in 2000, that we had identified a living wage being $15. So it was a big campaign to increase the minimum wage to $15. We're not quite there yet, but even if the minimum wage was $15, it wouldn't be enough, because that number has more than doubled.
That's right.
Because there were like around $34 an hour to be able to afford it on.
Yeah, and
So
yeah.
it's just getting worse.
yeah, unfortunately, we still see that, you know, troubling trend, right? I'm the past chair of a group called National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we're releasing our national report this Thursday called the Out of Reach Report. And that report shows housing wage, by state, and you're absolutely right, $15 does not cut it, and nowhere near close to the projected housing wage. So you would need to be able to afford housing, and that's household income, so it's not individual workers, but even to lower wage or minimum wage workers in a household still don't earn enough together to kind of afford current rent. And then the other problem is our underproduction. So not only is, you know, part of what's driving cost up and making the mismatch between the income and cost is certainly one part of the problem, but the other part of the problem is the vacancy rates are incredibly low, and have been for a long period of time. The market says that a healthy vacancy rate is anywhere between 7% and 8%. And Rhode Island, in particular, Providence vacancy rate has hovered mostly around 3%. So there's a lot of demand for housing and a lot of demand for rental units in particular, and we just simply haven't been producing enough. Again, Providence is doing better. There's more, you know, more stuff in the process and in being developed. Providence made some pretty significant changes to zoning over the last 5+ years, which has helped to expedite the process, but it's still pretty slow go to get actual units online.
I agree with you. We are so far behind that a great portion of this money is actually going towards restoration of some of these units.
That's right.
Because we're just so late on this.
Yeah.
In the housing trust that we have, that we make our investment with the DRA, some of that money goes toward restoring some of these homes already, because so much time has already passed.
That's right.
That they need restoration or to be able to
Yeah,
preserve
or
those.
they're at their end of their financing period. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, Rhode Island really has two housing problems, or at least two. One is a quality problem, a quantity problem. We just don't have enough of it, particularly at the lower income level. But the other issue is quality and age of housing. We have some of the oldest housing stock in the country. We're tied for third with Massachusetts for on the age of rental housing stock, and a lot of that housing stock has suffered from deferred maintenance in some cases, and or, you know, lack of good ownership, that have let the properties, fall under disrepair. But it's also a lot related just to the age. You know, like our bodies, right? Our housing has a life cycle. And so a lot of this housing, particularly older housing, is, you know, it's the big stuff, right? It's the roofs, the heating systems, the other things. And so when they come back, they're expensive, right? And it's expensive to repair them. A lot of the housing is also historic. And so we have a lot of, regulations and requirements that we have to use as part of that, as well too. So there's a number of challenges. So why I said, oh, there's my friend who's been working on housing stuff for a long time, hello. You've heard the speech before, you don't need me to repeat it, trust me.
No.
I think we got, I don't know if we have more copies of it.
In front of you,
We can
that's,
certainly- Oh, it's got it, okay, great. So welcome, counselor. I'm glad you're here.
see what she's talking about.
So where I think you should go.
Right, pay attention.
I'm boring him to death, I guess. Grant is always a great advocate, showing up at lots of different.
I
meetings.
don't know how you get the energy, he's always
I know.
here.
It's always
Yeah,
there.
He's always here, so I don't know how he.
I know.
You get
So when I looked back at the summary of, meetings, and you've heard a lot, sorry, I didn't know if we had a hand up.
You have to. Oh, okay, Councilwoman.
No. My question can totally wait. I was just referring to this, I noticed that there's about 4 communities in the state that have no initiatives to build. And I didn't know if there was anything since the production of this.
So, yeah, so in this particular case, we're only looking at units that had bond funding.
Yeah,
So pretty much every community has some affordable housing in it, but most of the communities don't have anywhere near the 10%.
Got it.
Most
Yeah.
communities are well below the 5. So within those 4 communities, I'm pretty sure all of them had projects that had bond dollars in
Got it.
in this latest bond.
okay,
But it doesn't mean that there's only housing authority, and, they may have a local housing authority, they may have public housing and other things that kind of qualify and count into that affordable housing. They may have group homes, they may have other things that count into the housing count, as well too. So this is only a snapshot of looking at projects that were actually funded with bond funds.
got it. Thank you. Never that.
Yeah, Councilwoman. My thing is, I was back in the 80s. I remember a lot of that stuff, and I think, we could try to move away from, the affordable housing, because we had so much, but now we don't have enough. But we don't even really have a lot of space to put it in.
Mhm.
If we look around, there's only so much land left, and our house in stock is old. My house is 1932 was when it was built,
Mhm.
so it'll be almost 100 years, So, and that's my whole street. There's no, there's one house on our street, and that was from the 80s. So we're not gonna get enough funds to do a lot of things that we really want to do, that's obvious. Do you see us, where else can we get the money? So how can we help the people that are living in these older houses? Fix them up or make them better, because a lot of the ones that are in these old houses are also kind of strapped for money, very strapped for money. I know this is not a question per se for you, but I'm just wondering, because you said next step. What are some of our next steps?
So I think, Providence has had a good history of home repair dollars and programs as well too, and I think we just have to continue to ramp that up, right? And ramp up that support for homeowners. I think you have to tie it to the homestead exemption, that you can qualify for some of those resources and other things. So I think there are definite ways that you can do that. You already have a fairly robust home repair program. The city also put in funding money from the federal government. But you can use your CDBG dollars and invest in that money, prioritize neighborhoods or communities, prioritize rental housing over homeownership opportunities as well too. And for many, many years, some of us sat on the first PPHC, Providence Plan Housing Authority Board, and then PNHC board. And as part of that, we use some of your bonding authority as a city to capitalize a home repair fund and dollars. So in addition to our housing production. So you can certainly look at that model again. I think the bonds were for the, I'm going blank on the one facility that the city sold off, oh my gosh, I'll think of it in a second, sorry, but anyway, so there's models, including models that you've done already here in Providence that you could certainly do again. And put a local bond on the ballot, you know, for home repair and maintenance fund and make it a revolving fund. You've got some good, strong partners in the Providence Preservation Revolving Fund and within the city department, you know, that has experience running these programs. So I think that's definitely one thing to address kind of the condition. You know, the other thing is we just gotta get this darn ADU legislation passed, because it's going to be a way to help a lot of homeowners, particularly older homeowners in Rhode Island, and in Providence and the port committees kind of stay in their home and age in place and provide some options for other households and other families. And we have to look at how to do ADUs on a more urban style of housing. So, you know, whether it's a garage conversion or a basement conversion or a way to use some of the multifamily housing for ADU parts. And that's, you know, ADU focuses a lot on kind of the more suburban style of housing, but I think there's many, many opportunities here in Providence for us to look at. And yeah, do we have to worry about Airbnb? Do we have to worry about it, you know, not being used by the right people? Yes, but there's ways that you can provide restrictions in the city or state. It's passed, you know, it's already passed, already been heard in House Committee, going to pass the House again. The Senate remains problematic on this. So, I mean, I'd encourage you to talk to your delegation and say, we want this done and see if we can get this over the finish line this session. So that's one step. And then, you know, looking at kind of the lessons that we learned from PPHC and PNHC about how to capitalize or how to kind of use some of the city's bonding authority for a home repair loan program or revolving program. The other key thing as I was looking at it, I don't know if you've had anybody in, I don't recall seeing it from the summary that Chris sent, but meds and eds. Both the medical facilities throughout the city own a lot of real estate, and they own a lot of parking lots, particularly in Southside. And I mean, I don't think we still have a pilot agreement, right, with the Lifespan. And I think it's a big opportunity that this council should take to say, you know, interestingly, many of the people who come into affordable housing come in from several professions. One is from the financial service industry, banking, and they're working at entry-level jobs at service centers and call centers in the banking field, and healthcare. And it's home health aides, it's CNAs, it's dietary staff in hospitals, it's other lower wage workers, to your point, Counselor, that, you know, they're just not paid a livable wage, even though they've got a really good job. So can we bring them on? You know, can we look at those opportunities in those neighborhoods? Can we come in and spend some money to do some planning charrettes? How can we create some housing for those workers above the parking? You know, can we create different ways to look at this space? Can we also green up some of those buildings? Because as we know, asthma rates and heat indexes and other things in those neighborhoods are much, much higher than they are than the rest of the city, largely because of the large swath of concrete that exists in all of those neighborhoods and communities. So if you haven't already been in that conversation, I think you need to. And you need to say, you know, because they're having trouble attracting and retaining workforce. So it's about, you know, helping them keep their own workforce, but also repurposing and reusing that space in a much different way than we have. And, you know, there's some poetic justice to this as well, too, because a lot of this land was taken, and many, many people who don't look like me were displaced in those neighborhoods and those communities. So how can we right some of those wrongs and figure out ways to do that? And I know you've got some interesting recommendations in the reparations report and other things, you know, may bring some people to the table, but we'd love to do a design competition to say we want 5 of the lots and we want to figure out how we can create housing above your parking, and, you know, have them kind of work with you on it and figure out ways. I know that a lot of those hospitals pay a lot of money for traveling nurses. They pay housing because they can't attract nurses locally enough. And they pay millions of dollars, for housing, for those workers. So what if we create some housing for them, you know, and have them invest that funding and money in a different way? I think I generated a question on that one or a comment.
No, because you went right where I was going, those places where they put those parking lots. Those were thriving communities, and they took them by eminent domain. And then they charge people to park in those parking lots, you know?
Yeah.
And so I'm loving the idea, about it. I don't know if you can enforce anything, but
So-
but
I think the next step for this committee might be, and I don't want to speak for you, Madam Chair, but I mean, I would, you know, invite the mayor, and the mayor's team has been working hard on the pilot payment, so, and pilot agreements. So bring them in for an update and say, can we add some housing conversation to this? Can we add some ways to see if we can talk about it? Because this is, and this is a charity, right? This is something that would benefit their bottom as well, too, in addition to, you know, improving health outcomes and providing opportunities in that neighborhood and community. So, you know, again, I presented you a lot of doom and gloom, so I want to present at least a few hopeful thoughts and ideas.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It
Yeah.
makes sense. It's in the era of time. I mean, like you said, the years and years, what makes sense? And what can we zone and what we can't zone, you know?
Yeah. And the
So
best way to
it's-
motivate people is when they see some benefit, in particular, some financial benefit for themselves, right? So you're not asking for a charity, you're not asking for, you know, give us a donation or bill, you know, you're asking them to address an issue around workforce development that they're having as well, too. So I think there's a different way to sell it than we've had before. And then the other part of the, a group and the institution, and, you know, and again, these institutional partners in the city add great value to the city and you know, not institutions that we're trying to get rid of. Certainly, they make Providence who Providence is, but educational institutions. And again, this is and colleges and universities in particular. We know, and we don't have the information and data on it, but there's about half the number of dorm rooms as there are students needing housing. So, and that's a statewide number, not Providence-wide. So that means that a lot of students are out in the private market. And we know, and you know, in your neighborhoods and communities that many students, and this again is a statewide problem, are, you know, renting, landlords are renting, and they much prefer to rent to 2 or 3 students in a 3-bedroom unit where they can get, you know, $3,000, $4,000 a month of rent, and not have to worry so much about getting the lead certificate and getting other things that they, you know, are supposed to do under minimum code law, but may not be as compliant with otherwise. And then those two, you know, but a family of more moderate income can't compete with that amount, right? So we know that students have a big impact on the rental market, and trying to figure out ways to increase or provide more opportunities. What I'd love to see, and again, this is something that potentially could be factored into the pilot agreements. I know that there are agreements with most of the educational institutions, but doing a housing impact assessment. You know, how many students do they actually have on the private market? You know, if they wanted to build dorm space, or if they wanted to acquire more property to build dorms, you know, where in the city could we potentially accommodate that? And so that would also be kind of an interesting next step to figure out whether we can bring them on as more of a partner in this work. They also have lots of low-wage workers, you know, in their cafeterias and their security guards. I'm not talking about the professors and the other individuals, although even at this income level, I hear regularly from our colleagues at URI have difficulty attracting grad students to their master's programs because there's just nothing affordable in Suffolk County. And so people have turned, you know, students have turned down opportunities to go to grad school there because they can't afford to live in that neighborhood or community. And these are exactly the folks that we want to continue, right, and stay. And so can we think of unique ways to encourage long-term commitment or a longer-term commitment with loan forgiveness if they buy homes in the neighborhood or community? So I just think we have to think about them more as a partner and not see it as adversarial and kind of town versus gown, kind of a mentality, and just say, we got a problem, how can we solve this together? So again, Madam Chair, I don't think we have them in, but I think there's some real specific things that you could do with both those partners that I'd encourage you to think about it, and to the extent that we can be helpful, we're happy to do that.
So, thank you.
Madam Chair.
Councilman,
Thank you. Thank you, Brenda, and,
When he was a senator, Councilor Paterno had to listen to me constantly on housing stuff at the state house, so.
Yes.
It's not new to him.
well, some things change and some don't. And, obviously, you all have heard from Brenda, and she's a pro, been at this for like 30 years now. No, it's actually great to have continuity on these issues. And I'm sure as I walked in, you were sharing the bigger picture and bringing it pretty much here down to Providence. I'm interested in finding out from you, perhaps you already touched upon it. As I said, some things change, some things haven't changed. It seems like we're still having the same conversations, the urban versus suburban, because they require large parcel to create
Yeah,
low to moderate income. I mean, I think that over time, we have been around talking about housing for a long time. We need to start moving away from this whole thing, affordable housing, but more for moderate to low income. Because at the end of the day, when we look at the homelessness, people that cannot afford it are those who are making less than $50,000.
yeah.
And they're out on the street. I also, as you mentioned, we worked for so many years on the housing and municipal government, and asking the General Assembly to put at one point, $250 million, right? It would have avoided all this problem, by the way. Right, but we never got it through, because, General Assembly is also very complicated, as Brenda continues to find out every year. So my question to you, one or two is, one is, how does the challenge continue to be greater, or has it lessened for suburban communities? As you mentioned, even around the URI, even those that have land, that in reality, we could be building even housing for, as I saw your perspective there, of those adults who are 55 and above, right? To take away the pressure away, as people are aging to those communities,
Yeah.
right? So has that changed a little bit? Are they promoting that? The other that I have for you is that as we're getting into this whole conversation regarding Airbnb and people managing this property, is there any conversation or what are your thoughts on putting a tax on those Airbnb at the local level in Providence and creating a fund to actually for home repairs and helping upgrade
Yeah.
the housing stock, not just only on the preservation side, because that's a whole different, it just costs more but to real homeowners who actually need the help.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting model. Again, I think Newport has looked at this as well too, as has Narragansett. I think it taxes them at the commercial rate. And that the differential between residential and commercial could go into the fund for redevelopment of housing. So, the Airbnb guys hate it when I say that, but you're running a business and you're using the real estate property as a business, and so you should be taxed at the commercial rate, in my opinion. I think that's an easy fix, but you could also, potentially have a surcharge and local communities. I mean, be prepared for hours and hours of hearings and lots of lawyers coming in to protest that if you go forward. But I would encourage you to check in with your colleagues on Newport City Council and on Narragansett Council, through the league, who can certainly share some of their experience on that.
They implemented it or?
They have not implemented it yet, but
Yeah.
they're, the Newport's pretty close. They did implement a version of it. I have to go back, to see exactly, because they did some pieces of it, but not the full, tax. I'll have to go back and see what they've actually passed.
And then the other one in terms of.
So the other one, I'm sad to say that NIMBYism, is alive and well, not in my backyard. The other acronyms of bananas build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody.
Yeah.
Hating people, citizens against virtually everything. And I'm sad to say that all of those community groups and individuals are alive and well in many communities. The opposition always shows up, to protest, housing development or proposed housing development. The people who need it, are often not available to come, and, the supporters don't always. And so we're trying to change that balance and work very closely with HESs and our CDC partners and, public housing folks to get more people at those hearings talking about the need and about, I'm the person who needs this housing, and make it real and hopefully much harder, for people to turn. But, I'm sad to say that it's still alive. I will say, however, that there's a lot more willingness, I think, in planning departments and city councils at the local level to say, this is really, it's an economic issue, it's they're starting to see the connections. And I think what the door that's really opening for us is climate change and the changing demographics and aging demographics in communities, but also coastal communities and other communities realizing that a huge amount of displacement is going to happen over the next 25, 30 years because of sea level rise and because of urban flooding and flooding that's already happening in communities. So I think it's providing us a common agenda that we didn't have before. We just had the Housing Conservation and Land Trust Conference this past weekend at URI, talking to all of the good environmentalists, and they're like, you're right, we got to pay attention to this, and we've got to plan growth and development better than what we're doing. We've got to look at ways to reduce our carbon footprint, or we're going to be in big trouble. So, and I think there's, so hopefully that opens the door, a little bit more where people start to again see a benefit for them and something that they know is at risk. But I think Providence has, and other communities where we're talking about development that makes sense, at least for affordable housing developers, is around transit corridors and hubs. And we used to get that in Rhode Island, and you only have to look at the Mill Village concept, right, where you have the job center and you have housing of varying types around the job center, right? And so trying to recreate that or connect transit and connect jobs and housing back together is part of what I think we're starting to see, some movement toward. Is it happening fast enough? Absolutely not. But
It's gonna take around 25 years.
yeah, I don't know about that, but hopefully, I don't think we have that long though. In terms of kind of the changing demographics and changing just buildable land. I mean, we're already seeing it in East Providence where they're already moving houses that essentially have just kept flooding. We're seeing it in Johnston, we're seeing it in Olneyville and Providence. So this is not the future, this is now. And so we've got to start to think about that and think about ways to kind of plan better and make sure that everybody has housing opportunities.
Thank you.
Okay.
As always, happy to come and talk at any point in time, but also if any of these thoughts or suggestions feel helpful, I'm happy to work with you and your team and staff here to try to implement them. But
We appreciate you, Brenda.
thank you.
Before do you have a question, You're here to.
Sure.
Something that you have.
I guess I kind of understand what your presentation was on. It was very like supply, building. Previously, as the Housing Crisis Task Force has met, there's also a lot of conversations about like renter protections. Things like rent stabilization was presented to the Housing Crisis Task Force, and I'm not a counselor, but often I staff meetings for them, and they're getting a lot of questions about rent stabilization. It's in the newspaper, it's in rallies in front of City Hall a couple times a week. I know that's maybe not per se in this vision that presented here, but I don't know if you have insight or input on how you view that within the sort of broader housing crisis conversation.
So I think it's an interesting point on first of all, we've made a lot of moves forward in the legislature this last couple of years for renter protections. The rental registry, and while it's involved in a little bit of a football debate back and forth between the governor and the AG's office right now, that will go a long way to helping us kind of know who owns what in the city, which is often not as easy to find as you think. And so having some that really good data and information, so that we can encourage and get landlords to come and property owners to come to the table to get their properties up to code and to get their properties up to deal with some longstanding issues that they may have in that property, to help them be able to keep their rents stable and affordable as well too, I think is part of that solution. So a lot of what's already passed around the lead, the rental registry for lead, and also some of the protections that were passed in the last session, I think go a long way. Rent stabilization is a harder one because part of the problem in Rhode Island is that because of the lower income that we see in Massachusetts and Connecticut, we don't the rents don't necessarily sustain development and development costs without some level of subsidy. So if you try to tie and stabilize or lower rent to that, it could have the negative effect of preventing development, or developers who have options and choices will say, oh, Providence is too costly, I won't develop there. And we know, and we hear, every developer, some developers maybe want too high of a rate of return, but when I look at performance and when I look at some of the stuff, even on the for-profit stuff, the margin's pretty thin because development costs and land costs and other costs are pretty high here because you're renovating old buildings, and if you've done any renovations in your old house, and you've done, you open up a wall, there's another problem that you run into in another higher cost area. And as I said, a lot of these buildings are at end of life cycle, and so expensive heating systems and now a lot of green requirements and so forth. So I think, there's individuals and folks have looked at this issue left and right around rent stabilization. I think it needs further study and needs to bring everybody to the table. I quite frankly have never been at a table where we've got all the parties. So I like to hear developers and renters talk at the same time and say, how come, why can't we, and just kind of work it out and see if there's some opportunities that we can do. If there's way through the tax system, that you can provide that kind of stability or rent stabilization. I will say, again, I think there are in some ways better tools in the city, like the tax stabilization plans and other things that you could do and that you could potentially look at rent caps as part of the TSA agreement with the developer in order to, but developers and banks and financing institutions like consistency and stability, and they won't finance you, whether you're a for-profit or nonprofit, unless you can show that cash flow in your pro forma. And so if you have this unpredictability, that a rent stabilization could potentially add to that, then that causes trouble. So, but I also know, again, as I said, we're the data partner with the eviction defense process with Rhode Island Legal Services and Center for Justice. I see the income levels of people coming in, and they need subsidy, they need help in order to do it. We saw it at the height of COVID when we had rent relief, for that brief period of time, people were actually able to afford rent, right? Because they had the necessary subsidy that they needed to subsidize their income level. So I'm not answering your question well, but it's a tough one because
Sure.
It has many, many factors to it. But would love a conversation where we bring both sides to the table to see if we can figure out some sort of balance. If we can look at the existing tools that Providence already has around the tax stabilization plan and TSA ordinance and other things. And then obviously you have the housing trust, can you use that as an incentive to have a developer agree to a stabilization plan.
Great, yeah. Good answer.
But it's a tough sell.
Brenda, I have, I have a question, statement at the same time, question and a statement. We've been privileged to meet, a developer, for-profit developer, what I'm talking about, Marathon,
Yeah,
who has been able to put those pieces together, find the taxes and make it work for a project.
Yeah,
What I usually hear is like, oh, the cost of the construction costs, I've heard that over and over and over. That's why we can't build affordable. But he's been able to do it. How do we take, well, I've been talking a lot, and especially here we keep them close to us so we can say, how do we use your brains to be able to
Yeah.
open up a conversation for other developers? This all started with the Fay Tower,
yeah,
when I kept holding back, because I kept hearing the city of Providence, especially some of these 10% communities that's supposed to be developing to at least 10% units, I heard them yelling affordable housing, so I'm like, oh, I'm gonna hold out until we can get this conversation going. And did, and what happened was, now we in this conversation mode where even for-profit developers are coming in and saying, okay, we can be a part of the solution, but they haven't been able to figure it out. And I say that to say this, I have a developer that was in my ward that's developing up everything on the west end. And he came here and said, how can I be a part of helping with affordable housing? Nobody could help him be able to figure it out. I think what was different with Marathon, they went through nonprofit, developers and had conversations and built relationships and were able to figure out where those taxes were.
yeah,
This guy, on the other hand, who's on the west end, still building and saying, I can build some affordable, but I need that incentive.
Yeah.
Sit here right at this table 3 times and we're not able to connect with that. How can we really be strategic about asking developers like we did with the Fane Tower, Mr. Fane, when he came here and saying, put affordable housing in there, put low income housing, but we had nothing. No, we had no pattern. We had nothing to offer. How can we get better at that? And I'm asking you because you already moving some pieces. How can we get better at really working and creating something for profit
yeah.
developers?
So some of the most creative real estate developers in the city are the nonprofits and the housing development organizations that work in your neighborhoods and communities. They know how to, turn over all the rocks and find all the stones. So, provide some opportunity for them to come in and do trainings or do sharing of pro formas or information about how they couple this together. Providence also, the TSA and the Housing Trust Fund are still relatively new phenomenons in the city as well too, and so weren't tools that were always available. So, I just encourage kind of, bringing everybody to the table and if this staff from Marathon House will kind of share their model, bring the CDCs in and other interested for-profit developers and say, all right, we need everybody to step up here. So, and ask them. And because I think that, the other part is that there's a lot of kind of expiring use properties in the city as well too. A lot of apartment buildings, a lot of other buildings that are kind of, what we call NOAAs, naturally occurring affordable housing or market rate housing, but we need those to stay, even if they don't have big subsidies. So how can we kind of do the, the more Councilor Pitardo's point about the more moderate income housing.
Right.
So again, I think you have convening power here. You can bring some of these parties to the table. They'll come if you invite them. And, I think you, as to the extent that you can, work as close as possible with the administration. This is a very solid team in the Department of Community Development and Housing that understands the federal programs and federal resources. So, and just say, let's find some sites, let's pick some areas, let's provide some incentives to get some things done. And I think that's where this group needs to go, you're done talking, right? You've heard from everybody, you've heard more than enough from me about the problem. You need to start to really get granular and really start to say, let's look at this site, let's look at that site, let's bring in the lifespan to talk about parking lots, and if there's opportunities there, let's talk about ground, what spaces do you want, and what spaces are you willing to give off to you know, to do some development of the workforce in the community. And then the private market, and private, commercial brokers and residential brokers, you know, and say, what can we do? Can we add a floor to a development? Can we add more units to a particular development to address housing? So
Appreciate you.
it's a lot of work though.
Oh, we're up for the task, we just want, like you said, we want to get it to move that needle,
Yeah.
in a way that is.
I mean, if I were you, and I'm, you know, trying to push this on the state level, I'm tired of talking up here. I'm tired to look and be laser focused on sites. What can we do on North Main Street? What can we do on, you know, other Prairie Avenue? What can we do on other commercial corridors in the city, and Chalkstone? And, you know, I mean, you name it, Providence has got all kinds of opportunities. There is a private developer doing some interesting stuff in Chalkstone. I can't think of his name right this second, that looking at kind of doing more market rate affordable and, you know, so bringing some of those individuals in.
Right,
talk
and
about-
we need to make the
Purpose
attack
and
of it easier for.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
How do we create some sort of
Right.
expedited review and appeal, you know, to move cases through? I mean, right now in suburbia, you know, it takes 2 to 3 years sometimes to get through the zoning process, and local processes is a little better in Providence. And so, and whether you're a for-profit developer or non-profit developer, time is money. And so the longer it takes us to assemble the project and to then get and then another year plus to get all of the funding for that project together, you know, it could be 4+ years, best case scenario, before we're actually building stuff.
Mhm.
And, you know very well, we've got people out on the street right now.
Right.
So, and regardless of whether we get to summer, you know, and people always think about shelter and emergency shelter as a winter issue, heat is just as deadly as cold. And, if you're living on the street, any time of the year is never a good time to live on the street. So trying to make sure that we're addressing this problem year round, I think is also critical, and more importantly, just starting doing stuff and trying stuff. Are we gonna get it all right? No, of course not, you know, but let's at least strive and start to do some development and learn from those mistakes and build some stuff.
Awesome. Any more questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thanks
Brenda.
again, appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks again. Yep.
All right, if there is no more business before this humble body, I motion to adjourn. Okay, a second, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? I love that.
Yeah.
Sounds like my hair. Yeah, you know, it sounds like my hair.
I'll gather up that. Finally, someone wants to
It's
take.
good to meet you.
Tonight.
I'll be your regular guy, I think. So, yeah. Well, Nick is leaving the office. I don't know if he was right. I don't know if he was doing this regularly.
Yeah.
He was, okay,
No,
right. And I'm taking over for him doing housing. So I'm gonna be doing